In the last list video I released, a request was made to look at the best finishing on bracelets under $1,000. I'm going to expand that ever so slightly to focus on watches with the best finishing in general, but as an addendum, all the watches featured are going to be on metal bracelets, which I think makes sense for a video like this. Before we get into the list itself, I think it's pertinent to explain what we actually mean by finishing on a watch. Finishing is a blanket term used to describe techniques applied to the watch at the end of the construction process. So, as an example, we could be talking about polishing or brushing the surfaces of the case, bracelet or movement, but it could equally be used to describe any number of processes applied to the dial. With that in mind, let's lay out some rules for the video. Firstly, the watch has to be available under $1,000. I'll mainly use recommended retail prices, but for some models I'll feature second-hand prices so you can see just how far your budget can stretch. Secondly, I'll only feature each brand mentioned once to try and create some variety. And finally, as I mentioned at the start, every watch must be available on a metal bracelet. A bit of forewarning, there are quite a few integrated bracelet watches here, because bracelets tend to be one area that brands cheap out on, and they can't really do that if the bracelet is built in. I've tried my best to get watches from across the entire price range, so with all that said, let's get into the video. With the caveat that every watch on the list needs to have a bracelet, it's perhaps unsurprising that we're starting off with a watch that's already at $200. It's worth contextualising this watch. It's high quality finishing for the budget, but not necessarily going to compete with the other models on the list. The real strength of the Falcon Eye range is the finishing touches to the dial, the hands, the applied text, logo and indices over the top of the rich patterned dial, which is fantastic. The case is also not without its merits, featuring brushed and polished components that really give this watch an air of quality alongside its retro feel. The bracelet is not going to be the best at this price point, so if you're worried about hair ripping or quality, for a few dollars more you can get the chronograph versions, which feature an upgraded bracelet more in line with standard sports watches. There are a range of dial variants available for the new San Martin GMT models, so I won't talk about dial finishing here, though it is impressive. Instead, I want to focus on the finishing of the case and bracelet. I don't think it's an understatement to say that this is the absolute best cost to finishing quality ratio you'll find anywhere. There are a number of Chinese brands who punch above their weight, but San Martin are, at least from my experience, levels above their competition. If you look at the whole package here, the GMT functionality, the materials, specifications and quality of the fit and finish, it's no exaggeration to say that if this was Swiss made, it might be so expensive it wouldn't even fit on this list. And yet, here we are, down at the cheaper end of it. Probably the most obvious entry onto this list, the $350 price tag is the cheapest price I could find for the 40 and 35mm quartz versions online. It's been said many times, but bears repeating, these watches wear bigger than their measurements would indicate because of the lack of flex in the first link of the integrated bracelet. Now, you could argue that the waffle dials have better finishing than the cheaper quartz alternative, but I think the star of the show really is the bracelet. So regardless of which movement you're interested in, I would definitely recommend the bracelet over the rubber strap alternatives. The finishing is superb, far better than it has any right to be, and static images don't really do it justice. When it moves under the light, the polished edges between each link really come alive. It's a model with great finishing at an affordable price point, and why it will always pop up on finishing lists like these. Now this may be a somewhat controversial inclusion on a list like this. It's an expensive quartz digital watch for one, and could be accused of being overly polished and shiny, a little too bling and certainly not to everyone's tastes. I can see the validity in those kind of points, and I can also understand that Casio might not be the first name you think of when it comes to finishing, but actually these models are really quite impressive. You'll no doubt have seen videos of people making Casios with aftermarket bracelets and cases. I've even had a go on this channel. But there are light years of difference in the quality, fit and finish compared to the official version. This is a watch I recently added to my collection that will feature on the channel in due course. I love the styling of this model, but it does wear larger on wrist than the dimensions would indicate. I think it's right on the limit of what I can get away with, but if you've got a smaller wrist than 6.5 inches, I would definitely avoid this model as it would end up giving some serious overhang at the lugs. Not only that, but the bracelet has so many components that this is easily the hardest adjustment I've ever had to do with any watch. Having said that, I do think it was worthwhile. The design is mostly brushed forward facing with polished chamfers and edges. The bracelet, while tricky to adjust, has so many different surfaces that it really catches the light during everyday wear. The small details like the thin polished edges to the indices also really pop and add that little bit extra to what is an acquired taste of a watch. But if you like it, you'll really like it. Again, perhaps controversial to include vintage models on a list like this, so I want to be very specific here. Clearly, if you buy a watch which is decades old, regardless of how good the finishing was to begin with, it's going to have seen significant wear and tear. However, one of the elements of finishing I introduced at the start was finishing the movement. Well-preserved Omega movements are absolutely beautiful, and unlike the rest of the watch, aren't going to have been affected by the ravages of time in quite the same way. The shots you're seeing here are from my 1961 Seamaster. It's one of the most beautifully finished movements in my collection, despite its age. I was really torn over buying a Manhattan recently. The only thing that stopped me is the existence of the 39mm ultra thin, which is a really impressive piece of engineering, coming in at under 7mm thick with a manually wound movement. But for me, it's going to have quite a lot of overhang on wrist given the effective lug to lug from the integrated bracelet, and isn't available in the smaller 37mm size. I didn't want to compromise, so I didn't end up getting one. That aside, the focus of the video is finishing, and what you get here is really impressive for the price point. There are chamfered edges everywhere, polished to a really high standard, so the whole case gleams when moving on wrist. Not only that, but the Côte de Genève dials are also a visual treat. I'm not the biggest fan of the aesthetic of the dual crown design of most Alpinist models, but this more stripped back version is really quite something. I think Seiko really haven't done the model any favours with the image they've used to advertise the model on their boutique website. It makes it seem extremely plain, which, as you can see from the other images of the watch, it is anything but. It boasts an excellent set of dimensions and specifications, but perhaps more importantly for this video, you're getting an unbelievable textured gradient dial and some case and bracelet finishing that quite clearly bucks Seiko's reputation for cheaping out on their bracelets. The penultimate watch on the list only just comes in under budget with a second-hand model, though you might be able to find cheaper depending on the availability on the second-hand market or if retailers offer a chunky discount on RRP. The modern F77 is very faithful to the original model on which it's based, and 1970s watches are not exactly famed for the quality of their bracelets. What does stand out is the finishing on the case, dial and movement. Two dial families exist: stone dials featuring meteorite, lapis and aventurine, and the one I'm highlighting here, which, while cheaper, is not less impressive. It's finished with a tressed effect, and with this brown model, a gradient colour scheme is applied across the top of that. Now, there will be some that simply look at this as a Royal Oak homage and are immediately disinterested, but that doesn't mean that the finishing isn't fantastic. The quality of the finish on the dial, hands and chamfered bezel edge and case is really quite something in person. Not only that, but unlike Hublot, they can be bothered to line up the screws on the bezel properly. The first thing I would say is that this price includes upgrading from the 3-link beta bracelet to the 5-link consort offering. The Valor is the cheapest model in the current Christopher Ward lineup when you take into account the bracelet, and indeed their only model with a quartz movement. That being said, it's a high-end COSC certified quartz movement. This isn't the sort of thing you're going to find anywhere near a cheap plastic watch. Christopher Ward have unbelievable finishing on their watches. Their attention to detail is second to none at this price point, and the reason I've gone for a new model rather than one of their older offerings second hand is the trademark light catcher case and that consort bracelet. The light catcher case was trademarked by Christopher Ward in 2014 and is their signature design that focuses on a mixture of polished and brushed surfaces to make the watch feel really dynamic in the light. The consort bracelet was a major release in and of itself and is constructed from over 200 individual components, a seamless butterfly clasp and the exact same standard of finishing. It barely squeaks in under the $1,000 limit, but it's also the best finishing you'll find under that price point. So, that's my list. I hope that's provided food for thought for some of you, but as with any list video, it's not possible to feature every brand and watch with top tier finishing. I'm always keen to expand my own horological knowledge, so if you think I've missed a contender from the list, please let me know in the comments below. I'll add that I'm also completely open to suggestion with these list videos. Tell me what you want to see, and I'll try my best to put it together for you. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, consider dropping the video a like, and subscribing if you want to see more content like this.